Because of this,
Panthers call timeout.
To determine if it was offside,
And Paul
prior
Maurice
to the goal.
is giving it to his team over on that bench.
I wanted to give NHL coaches the spotlight and take a look back at some of the biggest meltdowns by coaches in NHL history. This was probably some of the most fun I've had researching a video, and what I was able to find is both hilarious and outright crazy. I figure we start today's video talking about some coaches who are still coaching as of today, and when the words meltdown and hothead are said, a name that instantly comes to mind for many is John Tortorella. Tortorella has never been afraid to speak his mind.
You know, Redden sticks up for his teammates the other night.
Yeah.
And you come out with some sarcastic article.
It was funny.
It was funny?
Yeah. Well, you know what?
You were probably beat up in the bus stop most of the time.
I think so, huh?
And is also known to let his emotions run wild.
Joe hasn't won a thing in this league. He could go down as a player, being one of the better players in our league, never to win anything. So what he should do is just shut up.
He's had a handful of embarrassing moments throughout his career, but perhaps none is worse than his meltdown versus Calgary in 2014. In the same game that saw Kellen Lane have the shortest debut in NHL history, it was also his debut that partially caused the outrage from Torts. Let me explain. Visiting teams submit their lineups every night before the home teams do, and Bob Hartley decided to start his fourth line, letting them take the opening faceoff. Tortorella took one look at this as they approached center ice and instantly became furious, as Calgary's fourth line were all bruisers. Because of Hartley, Torts felt he had to retaliate in order to protect his players, and in return would send his fourth line bruisers out. As soon as the puck was dropped, chaos would erupt.
Is already looking at the and here we go. Bench. Line brawl to start this game.
What Torts may have forgotten was that those first 2 seconds counted as Kellen Lane's NHL debut, and since everyone dropped the gloves as soon as the puck was dropped, Lane had to follow suit, being ejected like the rest of his line mates, finishing his what should have been special night, playing just 2 seconds. Once the huge brawl began, the cameras would pan over to both teams' benches, and Tortorella was electric, screaming and yelling towards an uninterested Hartley as Flames and Canucks players on the bench began chirping one another. The whole scene was crazy, but nothing like the scene that was shown during the first intermission. Tortorella was extremely upset and decided to storm into Calgary's locker room to give Hartley a piece of his mind. Soon, Hockey Night in Canada was broadcasting Torts' attempt to break into and fight the entire Flames locker room, a scene that was, quote, dangerous and an embarrassment to the league. Apparently, Tortorella and Hartley had a similar situation play out while they were coaching in the AHL almost 20 years prior, where Torts accused Hartley of using, quote, goon-like tactics. So, when he sent out his fourth line that night, Tortorella could have gotten flashbacks. Both coaches were punished because of the incident. Hartley would get fined $25,000 and Tortorella would get suspended for 6 games. Torts cares a lot about his players, and that night, he showed just how far he would go to do just that. Another coach who's had an infamous outburst is current Capitals coach Peter Laviolette, as his screaming match with Penn's Tony Granato will forever be remembered. Laviolette used to coach the Philadelphia Flyers, and in a rivalry game with playoff implications on the line, things are bound to get nasty. Both sides wanted to prove that they refused to be pushed around, and that desire to send a message is what caused Dan Bylsma to do what he did. Late in the third period, Jacob Voracek would put the final nail in the coffin after scoring an empty netter to put Philly up by 3. But after the goal was scored, simply to prove a point, the Penguins would roll out their fourth line, which, similarly to Tortorella, made Laviolette lose it.
Peter Laviolette and Tony Granato, and Pierre is an innocent bystander.
Ultimately, Laviolette's team won the game. Despite that, however, he would still rip into Bylsma even further to the media, stating, quote, those guys hadn't been out there in 12 minutes. It's a gutless move by their coach. Gutless. Philly and Pittsburgh would later go on to face off in round 1 of that year's playoffs, where Philly would yet again take home the win. While researching this video, there was one coach I found who blew my mind. Tom Webster had not one, but 2 major meltdowns that deserve to be mentioned. So far, we've seen coaches yell at their players and try to fight opposing players, but never have we seen a coach actually physically hit a player. Till Tom Webster in a game between the Kings and Flames in 1991. As the players were gathering near the bench, an enraged Webster would begin running his mouth toward Flames' Doug Gilmour. Gilmour simply assumed that Webster was trying to chirp him, but Webster had other intentions. In flat-out rage, he would deck Gilmour right in the jaw, causing him to fall to the ice. And because of the hit, both teams would get in an all-out yelling match, with the plexiglass between the two benches getting broken off in the process.
Trainer with a stick. Now Roberts, number 10, trying to get over into the King bench.
Ironically, this wasn't even the first time Webster tried taking out a Flame, as a year before the Gilmour incident, he would harpoon a stick towards a Flames player, which is the perfect segment to his second outburst that I wanted to talk about. The second Webster incident, ironically, involves him throwing a stick. After getting frustrated by Kerry Frazier's call, he would throw a stick, javelin style, towards the referee. The dangerous play would land Webster a 12-game suspension, along with a $10,000 fine. But if you thought throwing a stick was bad, how about an entire bench? This is perhaps the wildest act of anger I've ever seen, and it's absolutely hilarious. But the reason why it happened in the first place isn't as humorous. During a regular season game between the Red Wings and Devils, Jay Pandolfo would get crushed in the offensive zone, leaving him in critical condition. But rather than deciding to stop the play, not only did the referees not call a penalty, they let the play continue on. As Pandolfo remained down on the ice, the Red Wings would enter the Devils zone, and Kirk Maltby would end up scoring off of that play. Robbie Ftorek, rightfully enraged with the lack of discipline, illustrated his frustrations in the most bizarre way ever seen, causing him to pick up and throw part of the wooden bench out on the ice. Ftorek would get fined $10,000 and get suspended for only one game. Pandolfo would require 84 stitches due to the hit, and NHL Executive Vice President Colin Campbell would release a statement stating, quote, "All coaches must meet a standard of decorum, and any coach who demeans the game is accountable for his actions." While serving his suspension, assistant coach Larry Robinson would take over. And funny enough, the following season, the Devils would fire Ftorek mid-season, where he'd get replaced by Robinson yet again, who, after stepping in, managed to take the Devils all the way to that year's Stanley Cup final, where he'd end up winning it all.